Day again, geckos. This is going to be part two of the discussion on the causes of the American Revolution. Again, this is going to be part two, so if you have not seen the first part, go ahead and take a look at that. We've already discussed this in class over the past couple of weeks, but this is really just for you to support you during your reviews if you need to study for a quiz or tests or any assistance when completing the assignments. What we're going to do, or what we did while we were in class, was I went over reminders and we reviewed the colonies. We went over the bell ringer, and then we went over the remaining acts triggering the American Revolution. Again, we have three learning objectives. The first being we will know the different acts which angered the colonists. We will understand how those acts snowballed into a revolution, and we will be able to explain how government decisions impact its people. So far, the acts that we've covered are the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, and today we will be getting into the Townshend Acts. Okay, so review, we are going to guess that colony, and we did that together. I gave you a photo hint of one of the original 13 colonies, and you had to guess which colony that picture hint represented. The first being this photo with a picture of Spider-Man in a fairly large city, and the answer was New York. The next being the former Nets logo, and this answer was New Jersey. This is a photo of a ship, a luxury liner called the Queen Mary, and the answer to this was Maryland. This is a photo of the Boston Celtics, and the answer to this was Massachusetts. And lastly, I showed you a photo of a Philly cheesesteak, and the answer to that was Pennsylvania. We went over two bell ringers, and I had asked you for your opinion on each of them. The first question was, if you were part of a Native American tribe and you had to create an alliance with British forces or French forces during the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, which would you choose and why? And you had to justify your answer. The second was, how would things be different if the French won the French and Indian War? How would life in Guam be different? Would it be different, or how would life in America be different? We're going to go ahead and head past these slides because we had spoken about this and I had addressed this in the first presentation. These are colonial clashes. This was a review that we had done on the French and Indian War. Proclamation of 1763, the results of it. The Sugar Act of 1764, which was the first act, but it was not a direct act on the colonists. It was a tax that was imposed on the merchants, so the people selling sugar, and as a result, they were smuggling sugar. And so Parliament, which is the British government, and the Crown, which is the king, decided that they were going to further tighten regulations and police them more and actually establish a court system that would try the smugglers. The Currency Act, which forbid colonists to utilize their own currency, which gave them a sense of independence. So they had to stop circulating that and resort to using British currency once again. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed that any item that basically dealt with paper, any piece of paper would have to acquire a stamp, which costs money. And I went over how the stamp itself was not very expensive, but it was just the principle of the matter, the fact that England was just using all of these responses as a means for them to fundraise. We went over the Sons of Liberty. We know that they were an underground terrorist group and they attacked stamp agents. They destroyed the lieutenant governor's home. and they were established in 1765 in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Now we're going to discuss the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend was the new Exchequer, which is the British Treasury Secretary. And I want you to get used to this term Exchequer because, as I had mentioned in class, when I moved forward into college, they constantly use this term Exchequer as opposed to using the word treasurer. Now, he established the Townshend Acts, and what his duty was is to basically help to revive the economy in the 13 colonies. But of course, he represented the British government, he represented Parliament, and his idea was to impose these taxes because the colonists were so upset about having to pay taxes for things that were already readily available. Things like the stamp. Why did they have to pay a stamp when they didn't have to before? Why did they need to pay a tax on sugar? So his bright idea was to have the colonists pay a tax on things that needed to be imported. And he felt like the colonists wouldn't be so upset about that because these are things that they didn't have readily available in the colonies anyway. So he enacted the Quartering, the Mutiny Act of 1765, which required the colonists to provide quarters, which is a home, and supplies for British troops in America. So while Parliament and the Crown were sending over these British troops to help to police some of the acts and to maintain order in the colonies, it was by and large the responsibility of the colonies and the colonists to house these soldiers and to provide for them, which, as you can imagine, would very much upset them. The Townshend duties was what created so much colonial fury because these placed taxes on imports from Great Britain, things like lead, glass, paint, paper, tea. And so, as a means to rebel, what they did was they stopped purchasing these things to show that they were pretty much boycotting and protesting these taxes. The Bostonians were especially upset at this because they heavily relied on imports to for their economy. So they were looking to things like lead and paint in order to sell or to utilize or to make whatever it is that they needed to in order to basically conduct business in Boston. And so you can imagine the Townshend duties greatly affected them. And so as a result, or in response to these acts, the Bostonians began to riot. And so what the British government did was they sent 4 British Army regiments to Boston, to the Boston Harbor, to kind of maintain order. Sort of like the way Donald Trump had sent the National Guard in to maintain order in certain places where they were protesting. It's pretty much the same thing, but just back in 1768. Well, in 1770, there was an incident that took place. Now, Townshend called these external taxes because, like I had mentioned before, these are taxes that were on items that had to be imported. So they were external in that they came from external items. Okay. And the colonists, their mindset was you can call them whatever it is that you want, but a tax is a tax is a tax. Now, in response to the Townshend Acts, before we get to the trouble in Boston, there are a few things that happened prior to that. And one is in 1767, the Massachusetts Assembly circulated a letter of opposition. Now, this was in opposition to the taxes, and you have to bear in mind that when they say they're in opposition to their mother country. So they're in opposition to the King of England and Parliament. It had little effect until the letter began to circulate, and I gave the example that it's almost like if you're in school and a letter begins to circulate about how much a student dislikes a teacher or even a principal, and that letter begins to gain some popularity because people are so interested in what this letter or what this person has to say. So it's kind of to the same effect, but of course we're talking government, so a much larger effect. With this letter in circulation, now the British government is understanding that the colonies kind of don't like the idea and are not supportive of their government, and they are rebelling. So now the people are taking notice of the Assembly's letter, and the assembly votes 92-17 to affirming their letter. This means that they are wondering who is going to support their letter, who's going to rebel against the King of England and Parliament, and who's going to stay mum and is okay with basically just remaining a colony. So a majority of them vote to support the letter and its mission. So the boycotts begin in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, against British goods subject to the Townshend duties. Townshend dies suddenly and his replacement repeals the duties. But after he repeals the duties, but before word gets around, the Boston Massacre occurs in 1770. Bostonians hated the Townshend Acts, as I had mentioned. They relied on these imports for their economy, so they began to riot. They didn't think that these taxes were very fair, and they were already going through financial hardship because, bear in mind, this is where the war actually took place. So they're trying to rebuild their life, only to find out that they have to pay these taxes that didn't exist before. The British Army regiments were sent to occupy Boston Harbor to maintain order. 8 British soldiers fired into colonial protesters, killing 5 colonial protesters one night. And this became known as the Boston Massacre. News of the murders spread and motivated the colonists for the upcoming revolution. Now, interestingly enough, news of the 5 murders began to spread. These British soldiers were actually arrested, but their attorney was Samuel Adams, who was actually able to get them out and bail them out. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to go over the assignments that are going to be due this week. So we will get into all of this stuff next week. We just have a bit more to go. And right here, I talked about this vocabulary chart, and I gave you the Proclamation Line of 1763, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Stamp Act, Sons of Liberty, Townshend Acts, and then the Boston Massacre, all of which we had discussed in class. You are to provide a definition. Now it's up to you. You can utilize the slides that I'm going to be uploading or have uploaded in the past, especially for the Proclamation Line of 1763. You'll write your own definition or type out your own definition. You could just click on it and then start typing away. Then you'll find an image that correlates with the topic, the vocabulary word, and you'll copy and paste an image that represents each of these vocabulary terms. Now going down to the next assignment, which is the Boston Massacre assignment. I've given you a picture that represents the Boston Massacre. You are to go through each of these 5 call-out boxes, which I had gone over in class, and you are to answer the call-out boxes in response to this photo or this piece of work. It says, describe the background of the image. What buildings do you see and what time of day is it? Who appears to be the aggressor in this image? How can you tell? How did the townspeople appear in the image and what are they doing? How many British soldiers are there? How do they appear? And then find another image of the massacre and compare it to this one. What are some of the differences that you see? So this last one's going to require a little bit of research. Also, when you find that picture, I want you to hold on to it because this picture is going to be presented in class on your part very, very briefly, but it's going to be presented nonetheless, and you're going to discuss it with the class. Okay, so those are the 2 assignments that you have that you're going to complete, and you will have these completed by Monday. I know I initially said Saturday, but I'll give you a couple more days to complete it. Okay, if you have any questions, please email me, nbdelgado@gdoe.net, and we can go ahead and discuss it prior to you submitting it.